Ambassador Bajpai, Ambassador Gould, Ambassador Gibson, members of the Council, friends and guests, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening. We'd like to thank, as is our custom, the Westinghouse Corporation for so kindly sponsoring this evening's reception. I'd also like to make one announcement, and that is to remind all of you that helping us celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Council next week on April 18th will be the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim. That's a Thursday evening. The meeting will be at the Omni International Hotel Ballroom, not here in this location. Contrary to an earlier implication of our announcement, you may attend both the dinner and the address, or the address by itself. In order to help you sign up for the event, you may do so at the entry table after this evening's program is concluded. Since it is the 5th anniversary of the Council, we hope that as many Council members as possible will be in attendance. It's my pleasure to introduce a member of our Board of Trustees, the former United States Ambassador to the Netherlands, 1973 to 76, Kingdon Gould. Ambassador Gould.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In thinking this evening over what I might say by way of introducing my good friend Ambassador Bajpai to you, I'm always struck at the difficulty that I have in relating the marvelous country that he represents to ours. I know it's a terribly foolish thing in a way to make comparisons, and yet it's hard not to relate a foreign country to your own. India, of course, is so much older than the United States in terms of culture and history, and so much younger than the United States in terms of its political existence. India is 3 times in population our country. And in the period of the last few years, there have been compressed into the history of India their independence, as was ours, from Great Britain, not yet 40 years ago, a civil war of immense proportions that took place, the assassination of 2 spectacular political figures, their most charismatic leaders. It is as though we've had our own independence, our own civil war, the assassination of President Kennedy, all rolled together in such a very short period of time. The ambassador who is our guest this evening is a man of great erudition, and as you will see, is particularly well qualified to interpret his fabulous, complex country to us. He had his education at St. Albans School, his high school education at St. Albans School in Washington for 4 years, during which time he lived in the residence that he presently occupies, for his father was, in effect, the ambassador of India, but during that time he was the agent general of India. So Ambassador Bajpai has come full circle and come back to the house in which he was raised and now as the ambassador of his country. He obtained his university education at Oxford and afterwards at the Institut des Hautes Études at Geneva. He started his foreign service career in 1952, about 5 years after independence of his country, and has had a remarkably distinguished career. He served as a consul general of his country in San Francisco. We made a wonderful number of friends whom I had the pleasure of meeting at a dinner at his home just recently. He served as his country's representative to Sikkim at a time when the boundaries are still very much in dispute and continue to be with the large power to the north. He served as his country's representative to The Hague, where I had the pleasure of making his acquaintance. He then went to China as his country's representative as ambassador to China, and after the restoration, or for the purpose of restoring relations with Pakistan following the break in relations between Pakistan and India at the time that Bangladesh emerged as a separate country, he was summoned to perform the function of reopening relations with Pakistan. So you can see we're indeed fortunate to have so distinguished a representative from India. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my good friend, Ambassador Shankar Bajpai.
Ambassador Gould and friends of the Baltimore Council, I'm very flattered that you should include me in your program for this year, and it's a particularly appropriate time for me to talk about my country because we've been through a very traumatic year and are now embarking under a new government on a new phase of our independence. I cannot live up to the expectations that Ambassador Gould has aroused by that very flattering introduction. I must say that the opportunity of growing up in this country left me not only with an admiration for it, but the feeling that we ought to have a much deeper understanding of each other than is sometimes apparent. So I do feel it's a singular duty as well as a privilege for an Indian ambassador here to try and address audiences like this about various aspects of his country. I do it with considerable temerity, though, because I know how exacting these audiences can be. But more than that, I do it with a sense of hesitation because of the complexities that I have to deal with. Ambassador Gould mentioned that I had been in China and Pakistan, which I considered among the most arduous assignments that an Indian can have, for obvious reasons. But it's nothing compared to this, because they had the great advantage, if that's the right word, of being purely government-to-government relations, whereas here the public has such an enormous input and one has to try and explain oneself to audiences like this. So it imposes a very heavy burden on me, and I hope you'll bear with me if I ramble a bit. I'd like to thank Ambassador Gould for drawing the parallel. There are many reasons why India and America should think of each other as having had common experiences, and not merely the fact that we were both under British domination at one time. We did also go through very traumatic developments. I'd just like to correct one point. I'm glad to say we never went through the horrors of a civil war, though we've had much civil strife to contend with. But otherwise, we have indeed compressed much of your historical experience into a few years. And I suppose that's the way things go. Everything moves faster. But the values that informed your own evolution as a nation state are also the ones that guide us. So when I come to talk about the foreign policy of India, which I see has been the subject for my address to you, I think it's important to realize that we approached the world in very much the same way as you did when you were starting to look at the world as an independent state. It is a coincidence of history that India emerged on the world scene again just about the time when you started to discharge your enormous global responsibilities for the first time in history, namely just after the Second World War. But there were earlier experiences which both you and we had, which led to the type of approach to the world which you can find advised as the right course for the United States in Washington's farewell address, which I have often quoted as the foundation of non-alignment, which is the characteristic of India's foreign policy. Unfortunately, in the post-war world and the complexities that have arisen, the United States had to adopt a different approach because of the Cold War and other crises that your global responsibilities put on you, and which made the contention with the Soviet Union perhaps the dominant feature of international life. That has led sometimes to misunderstandings between us, but I'd like to try and put the reasons why we have a much deeper relationship before you by putting the evolution of our foreign policy into the perspective of our own national evolution, which is comparable to yours. I don't think I need to stress to an audience like this that there are two prime objectives every government must serve in its national as much as in its foreign policies, namely the maintenance of national security and the development of economic well-being. And those were the two prime objectives of India when we became independent. We were extremely fearful of that independence. It had been hard won, and there were pressures at work in the world that made us fear that new forms of domination, economic or what are called neo-colonialistic, might affect us. So the initial priorities of India were, first of all, to keep aloof from all foreign entanglements, which was, as I say, the advice George Washington gave everyone. And the second factor was to try and develop our national economy in terms of an autarkic approach, which also limited our economic ties with other countries. These have had lasting effects on our relations with the United States, to which I will revert at the end of my talk, since that is the prime focus of my being here. But to give you the broad outline of our approach, we were most of all pressing for the early end of all other colonialisms that were still enduring in the world, and we were pressing for the strengthening of the multilateral institutions which both America and India attached so much significance to in the immediate aftermath of the conflicts. We found that the world was becoming a little more complicated than either of us had realized, and in that process, India became involved in a great many areas outside its immediate neighborhood, which took us far away from our objectives of national security in the immediate sense, and made us get a reputation of being something, well, the critics would call it an international busybody, but certainly involved in the safekeeping of peace. This was what brought us into play as a member of the Neutral Nations Commission for Korea. It brought us the chairmanship of the problems facing Indochina. It brought us to head the UN operations in Lebanon. It took us to be a chairman of or rather the leader of the international group in the Congo crisis, and in other ways try to become an effective and helpful member of the international community. In that process, it was often said that India became more involved in the great international issues of the day than in respect of its own immediate neighborhood. Unfortunately, we had one immediate problem from the very moment we were created, because independence brought with it partition, and partition created a state on our border that did not accept the theory of secularism and based itself on a religious principle. The fact that we had at that time nearly as many Muslims as Pakistan did made it incumbent on us to try and develop a secular polity, and therein lay the first crisis we faced, namely over Kashmir. That led to a conflict with Pakistan, which was repeated in 1965 and again in 1971. We then became a little more conscious of the immediate environs of our country and the importance of its region, an awareness that was made more painful and more immediate by the conflict which evolved with China in 1962. These two sets of experiences made us realize that howsoever much we might approach the world in the idealistic terms that we first started with, we could not afford to carry on the traditions of nonviolence or the complete faith in international institutions, which were the twin pillars of our early approaches to the world. And we therefore had to resort to a modest effort at military preparedness. But by and large, we still continued to try and give emphasis to those international issues which we felt were in danger of bringing the world into conflict, or which we felt were standing in the way of the betterment of the former colonial countries which we felt were the most important priorities the world should look at. We therefore tried to think of some substitute for the inadequacies of the international system and to try and buttress that system and the efforts of other powers by a fresh approach. The first conference in 1954 of the freed countries in Bandung was the starting point of this approach, and it has evolved through successive conferences in Belgrade, in Cairo, and other capitals into what is nowadays called non-alignment. This remains a very major feature of our foreign policy. It has tried to eschew involvement in what we all accept, as I said a moment ago, is the dominant feature of international life, namely the so-called East-West conflict, or mainly what I said was a fear the United States has of Soviet expansionism and, as the Soviets tell it, of American domination. We did not wish to enter into that polemical argument, but we felt that rather than try and side with one side or another, we would try and evolve areas where neither superpower need have any involvement whatsoever. That was the positive aim of non-alignment, and it has tried to be the guiding spirit of our approach to most international issues. While relying on that to be the safeguard of our own national interest and to be our contribution to the international system, we have also, as I say, had this painful realization that we must look to our own frontiers. And that has, in recent years, made us particularly conscious of the need to attend to the problems of our region. We have one grave misfortune. We are bigger than any of our neighbors by far. And as I think you know, it is not easy to be the biggest neighbor in your region. Everyone else tends to think that you're likely to bully them. And this has raised a number of psychological problems in our dealings with our own neighbors. But by and large, I think it can be said that India has not tried to exercise its influence outside its boundaries. We have, on the other hand, tried to deal with the problems that are facing us in regard to our neighbors in a spirit of cooperation. And this has given rise to what is one of the key features of our approach to foreign policy, namely to strengthen our region by further involvement of each of the countries of the region in a cooperative enterprise of both national security interests and economic interests. This is hardly a feature new to our region, or indeed to our world. It has been the tendency in many parts of the world. The European community represents one such effort. ASEAN represents another. You have your own efforts at cooperation in the Western Hemisphere, and it would have been even from the very start the natural condition for what is known as the subcontinent. But for the reasons of our historical evolution, which involved us in this conflict with Pakistan and China, and also I think because every other country wanted to be equally confident of its own independence, we did have these little bickerings, you might call, with most of our neighbors, and it was the tendency of each member of that region to look almost everywhere except towards each other. Nothing symbolizes this so much as the simple fact that you cannot today fly from one capital of the subcontinent to another without changing planes. The only exception, oddly enough, is Kathmandu, which seems to be emerging as a sort of international civil aviation center. But otherwise, you simply cannot go from one capital of the subcontinent to another without changing planes. That, to my mind, is a complete illustration of the way the countries of the subcontinent have failed to tackle the issues of the region in the way that they ought to. The late President of Bangladesh, General Mujib, had the foresight to see that this should not be allowed to go on. And just before his untimely death, he had made a proposal that the countries form a grouping which is now known as SARC or SARC, South Asian regional cooperation. And we have been emphasizing this as one of the main elements of our foreign policy as a means of improving relations with neighbors through a multilateral effort so that no one need feel that India is attempting to be a dominant power. We have had a series of meetings at officials levels and are now moving towards a summit for the first time, where we are tackling, you won't believe it, such mundane issues as locust control or flood warning, which, as I say, should have been the very hallmark of our relationship with each other, but which we had neglected for so long. We believe that this is an approach that will give us the opportunity to develop other and better political understandings and help our region maintain its, shall I say, independence from outside forces, as well as develop a greater economic strength. Now, I emphasize the regional approach because it is the very recent development in our foreign policy, and it is one to which we attach the greatest importance. I think it is fair to say that by and large it is a region that is not thought of very often from America. It is partly because, by and large, it has remained a very tranquil area, except for the occasional conflicts that I have already referred to. And when it enters your horizons, it does so because you have strategic and economic interests to the west and to the east of us. The South Asian region itself tends to fall between those two and evokes your interest only when something happens that impinges on those interests to the east and to the west, as is evident from the Afghan crisis. We ourselves feel that we have been fortunate in keeping our region free of great power rivalries, at least till recently, and that it is now time to move forward to give it a positive contents by this cooperation that I referred to. We also believe that the region has the potential for greater problems than is often realized. I don't know whether anyone in America has ever thought about it. I find very frequently people in my country haven't. That India has more neighbors than almost any country in the world except China and the Soviet Union. We have 11 neighbors. We have mountain neighbors. We have jungle neighbors. We have desert neighbors. We have ocean neighbors. We have communist neighbors. We have Islamic neighbors. We have Buddhist neighbors. We have military dictatorships to deal with. We have, fortunately, at least one democracy to deal with also. But I mention these simple facts to draw your attention to the enormous complexity and variety of strategic and diplomatic problems that India faces. And I don't think it has sufficiently been realized how well we have served the international interest by contributing to the stability of this area. We contribute to it essentially, of course, by keeping our own population of 700 million people from the temptations of revolutionary solutions, but we also help by keeping our neighborhood itself more or less at peace. And that is the type of contribution to the world community which I believe the United States would like to encourage. I would like to use that as a point of departure for my main focus of today's remarks, which is the relationship with the United States. We started, as we said a moment ago, really at the same time after the Second World War, at which time we knew hardly anything about each other. We had never been part of your historical consciousness, and for the previous 200 years, our own relationships with the world had been determined by London, and we knew very little about the United States. I think we started with great expectations of each other. That was the time when we had enjoyed the benefit of enormous goodwill from the United States and the positive contribution of President Roosevelt's government in encouraging the independence of India. I think we enjoyed certain advantages that made us have a place in the American consciousness which was very helpful and large without any background. Namely, we were the first of the countries to become free from the colonial yoke. We were the largest of them. We were also the most effective of the democratic countries that emerged. We had an enormous reserve of trained manpower which enabled us to tackle many of our problems of evolution and development. We had very great leaders who were well known outside. And I believe that all this led to a certain expectation from the West in general and America in particular as to the role that India could play. And on our side also, we had enormous admiration for the idealistic traditions of the United States, no less than for its enormous strength. And also shared with you that belief in those international institutions to which I referred earlier, and which we felt would bring us much closer together. The world proved too complicated. We had a certain difference of perspective. Whereas your priority was the containment of communism, ours, as I said, was the early ending of colonialism. That need not have led to any bilateral differences, but in 1954 the United States entered into a military aid program with Pakistan, which did introduce a bilateral difference into what was otherwise a general difference of approach. It was compensated to a large extent by the enormous US aid to India, which helped us at critical times and in critical areas. It also was compensated by the fact that gradually, as tensions between India and Pakistan eased after 1965, the United States adopted a certain balanced approach towards the subcontinent. If we look at it today, that is about the level at which relations have remained. There has been very little by way of additional contents to our relationships. We have found very little to do with each other by way of trade. It was never traditional between us, and today at $4 billion represents less than 1% of your global trade, although you are our largest trading partner in the world. Your investments in India are less than $500 million. I'm not making this a test of relationships, and I must also make it clear that all this is partly because of what I called our autarkic approach to economic development, which didn't want us to go in for much investment from abroad. But it is an illustration that in this modern world where the economic relationship often overrides and certainly always underpins other relationships, that between the United States and India is very, very empty. We have had a good deal of what you might call political dialogue, but also political differences. The comings and goings between the peoples of the two countries are largely limited to a certain amount of tourism. And therefore, there is enormous scope for our adding to the inputs that should make us more fruitfully engaged with each other. I believe that the differences that have arisen over our foreign policy have largely been over third country problems or regional problems, and have never had a really severe bilateral contents. We therefore have the beginnings now of a new possibility where we can put fresh contents into our relationships. This has been recognized in recent years by people on both sides. The trade has been growing. We have tried to have a fresh approach towards international investment. We have an enormous new and unforeseen advantage in our relations with the United States, which is that we now have nearly 500,000 people of Indian origin in this country who are making an enormous contribution to their society, having come with high qualifications and not like the normal immigrants that one thinks of traditionally. With the greater significance that we are attaching to the strengthening of our relationships, we are making efforts to try and have dialogues about international situations which will ease the problems that may have barred our relations in the past. This was a deliberate effort of Mrs. Gandhi's government when she first went to meet Mr. Reagan at Cancun, and then when she came to Washington and again met him in New York last year. This was followed by the visits to India of your Secretary of State and Vice President, and will now be renewed by the visit of our Prime Minister to this country in June. These high-level exchanges may be taken by cynics as being the routine of modern diplomacy, but they do, in the fact that they have taken place within this short space of time, they do symbolize the new interest that we are taking in each other. And I think that is because there are people in this country who recognize that India does have an important role to play in its region, and that its policy of non-alignment is not something that needs to stand in the way, but is indeed an asset that needs to be cultivated. We on our side have always recognized the importance of the United States in the world. We welcome so much that the United States has done that we would like to have more opportunities for influencing your thinking in these matters. So the relationship with the United States is not something that I'm putting before you as one of those conventional things which, as ambassador to the United States, I must naturally emphasize, nor is it something purely personal because of my own upbringing in this country. But I do say to you that there is a genuine and objective realization in the two capitals in recent years of the significance to each other of what the other can do and may do. And this has acquired a healthy new outlook in recent months. I believe it will be a significant contribution to the evolution of those goals that both of us have always valued. And I believe that it is going to lead to a much closer exchange between our two countries, which is healthy for both of us and I believe for the international community. Our primary objectives must be the stability and tranquility of our region, and I believe that that is what the United States would like to see also. Our second and no less urgent, but we have to limit our resources, our secondary goal must be to continue to make that type of contribution to the international system that used to be so highly regarded many years ago, and which we have continued to try and work for, whether in terms of North-South dialogue or of East-West détente, but which has lately been overtaken by the bilateral exchanges which are more characteristic of our day-to-day. And beyond that, we have this very significant new interest in making the Indo-American relationship a more harmonious and productive one. So those are three aspects of our foreign policy that I would like to put before you in this very brief and obviously inadequate survey. I hope it has given you some pegs on which to hang a few questions. I personally enjoy these occasions most because of the reactions I get from this audience, and I would therefore pause at this point and ask you to try and get something more substantial out of me by asking the questions on the points that you are interested in. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Ambassador, we certainly thank you for such a evenly paced, comprehensive, and coherent presentation of the foreign policy of India. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions, as you know, until 10 minutes after 7. Mr. Ambassador.
Oh, that's right, yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, when the Pakistani ambassador was here, he noted that his greatest participant was not the Soviet Union, but India. And we was queried about his nuclear power plant's ability and all that. Could you expound upon it? You look at Pakistan as a threat, and as such, if you do, kind of bring the nuclear power.
Having spent almost half my career dealing with Pakistan, I had hoped never to enter into public argument about Pakistan, but I'm afraid if that's what you have been told, I have no option but to contradict it. I'm sorry, did anyone hear that question? You did ask me to repeat it, but I forgot. Did you get the question? Was that the Pakistani ambassador had come here and said that the greatest threat to his country was not the Soviet Union but India, and when queried about his nuclear capabilities, I don't quite know what he said, but anyway, he fobbed it off.
If I may, Mr. Ambassador, I think that he might have been heard to say that, but in all fairness to the Pakistani ambassador, I think he also said that it was the policy of that country to resolve whatever differences there may be with India by peaceful means and negotiation, and that the general tenor of his statements was not necessarily hostile. But if indeed that was his position, would you respond to that hypothetical or real position?
As I say, I hate to enter into a public controversy over our relations with Pakistan. I think the facts are well enough known, but the perspectives naturally differ from Islamabad to Delhi. You added the question, do we consider Pakistan a threat to us? The answer is yes and no. It is no in the sense that a country of our size and population and industrial capability would be very foolish to go around the world saying that a country of the size and capability of Pakistan is a danger to our national unity. With our staying power, obviously any conflict must go to our advantage. But nevertheless, we have to look upon it as a danger, because the experience has been that despite these obvious facts, Pakistan has attacked us 3 times. It has a striking capability which in a short, limited war can give it enormous advantages. And these conflicts we have had forced upon us in the past have all been short, limited engagements. Any prolonged war is not only something we don't like to think about, but would be of obvious devastation to such large areas of our country that we rule out the very possibility. We would like equally to rule out the possibility of a short, sharp engagement. But that has not left us, unfortunately, and that is why the supply of sophisticated equipment to Pakistan, plus its own clandestine nuclear program, does give us the most enormous anxieties. And that is the one point on which we differ with the policymakers of Washington most sharply. I think it was very candid, and he's not the first. It has been stated even by his leaders back home, but it was candid of the Pakistan ambassador to say that they considered India the greater threat. What we see is precisely that from the other point of view, that the weapons that they are being given will not be used against the Soviet Union, but against us. And this is why we have had this problem, that whenever they turn to you and you give them the type of equipment that they are supposed to use to have a better defensive posture vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, in fact, they develop a level of political support from the United States, which turns them away from cooperation with India and back to old confrontational policies, which has been our experience in the last 2 years. We have tried, despite their involvement in many of our domestic affairs and despite their efforts to revive the Kashmir issue, to try and concentrate on improving relations, partly through this multilateral forum that I referred to as SAARC, and partly through bilateral negotiations. We recognize that Pakistan does have its own security apprehensions, both in regard to the Indian frontier and to the Afghan frontier. We would like to be able to develop not only détente with Pakistan, but the type of really heavy involvement in each other's progress and national life, which are natural to neighbors situated as we are. And we believe that the type of cooperation we would like to have with Pakistan is a far greater support to Pakistan's security problems than any amount of foreign arms aid that they may get. So we are engaged. Indeed, our Foreign Secretary has just come back from a visit to Islamabad, and we are hoping to embark on a fresh effort at dialogue. But I would say that there is a continuing anxiety in India that Pakistan has not given up the dream either of reaching Delhi one day or of revenge for 1971, as is often talked about. This, therefore, does leave us worried, but we are hoping that we can work out the type of understanding when these misgivings and fears can be considered fully a thing of the past.
Some of its import restrictions on Japanese automobiles and such things. Is this being aimed also at the United States? Are there products here that we could now sell in India more easily than we could previously? What might they be? And if there's something right in this area that might be of interest to India, for instance, coal from West Virginia?
Yes, indeed, there has been a very deliberate effort by the government of India to try and liberalize our import regime to enable us to benefit from not only greater trade but greater industrial investment. And therefore, we have both simplified and liberalized the terms of international involvement in our industrial growth as well as our trading policies. To be fair, I think this goes back to the last 2 or 3 years when Mrs. Gandhi had very consciously set about this. It was aimed at no particular country as such, though obviously the United States is an important target country for anybody who sets about this type of liberalization. We have had some increase because of that. Actually, by sheer coincidence, the trade increase is not due to that, but to the fact that, believe it or not, we sell you $1 billion worth of oil every year. But that is just fortuitous, and I'm not sure it will last when we build up our own refineries. But anyway, the type of new inputs that we want have yet to come, and this is something which we would like the American audience to look at more closely, because you're quite right, the Japanese have come in. And they, as you know, are very much more cautious than you are even. And they came in with the collaboration in the production of automobiles. It is not that we have opened our doors. We have a very strict policy of not allowing the import of consumer goods. We have an enormous middle-class market. And when we talk of averages, then of course everything comes down. But alongside our enormous poverty, there's at least a good part of our population which offers an enormous market because they have the money and they have the urge. But we have always felt that that should be fed by domestic production. Consumer goods are the type of things which our industrial capability should now be ready to tackle, and is tackling, in fact. What we do want is the more advanced technology which we need to try and cope with the problems of the poorer segments of society. So it's not in the consumer goods areas, but in the industrial areas that we have looked for more foreign involvement, both in terms of trade and in terms of investment. I might say that I think it's right that last year, out of 500 technical collaboration agreements that were sanctioned by the government of India for private enterprise in India, 240 were with the United States. So there is an enormous amount of involvement, but in rather small firms. There's nothing very big that has come about. But we have just a few months ago worked out what is known as a memorandum of understanding with your government, so that any apprehensions you have about the security aspects of what you may allow us to get from you, those anxieties are relieved, and we can therefore now get clearances for a lot of collaboration or even sale arrangements that have been held up on your side all these years. So there is certainly, and that's why I tried to mention in my main remarks, that there's certainly a very encouraging new potential for, or should I say the potential has been newly recognized and newly encouraged for both trade and investment.
Mr. Jacobs.
Mr. Ambassador, if I may draw the conversation back for a moment to Pakistan. In the event that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan turns into an annexation, what then would you expect in response from Pakistan first, and more important, second, from India?
Well, sir, our basic assessment is that that will not happen. So I can only indulge in speculative responses when I go beyond that. Assuming it happens, I'm sorry, the question, would you like to repeat it?
The question is, if in case the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan should be successful, what would be the reaction of, first of all, Pakistan, and secondly, India?
Yeah.
Annexation
Occupation.
resulting from success of that invasion. Annexation, yes.
As I say, our own assessment is that the Soviet presence in Afghanistan will not become an annexation. We have made it clear that we ourselves believe the Soviet forces must withdraw, and this is the view of the entire international community. There's no difference of approach. I think to say there is no difference of view on that. There are other differences of approach between us, partly, I think, arising from a difference of this assessment. We do not feel that the Soviet Union intend to stay there, and therefore the question of what we would do if they do has not really been all that carefully considered. But the Pakistanis also have, as far as I know, been working for the removal of the Soviet presence from Afghanistan, but are involved in this insurgency which operates from Pakistan, which has made dialogue between them and Moscow rather difficult. We have tried in our own way to see if we could help that dialogue, but have found that on the whole it's best to support the Secretary General's efforts to try and develop a solution that will enable the Afghan refugees to return and also to enable Afghanistan to function as a fully independent and non-aligned state. We believe that this aim can be realized, and therefore what would be our reaction if it is not is something that we only consider in the deeper recesses of our mind, and it has not evolved into policy positions.
Yes, sir.
In regards to your desire for industrial commitment, I wish we could take under advisement Union Carbide. If I understand it correctly, it's basically a 50-50 within 2 or 3 percentage points between Union Carbide, the parent company, and I'm not sure if it's the government of India or investors over there. I don't know who has the other approximate 50%.
The question is...
Well, that's just part of it.
Oh, I see.
But to clarify on that point, because they're not clear. And then somehow or other, water gets in the tank, and a terrible, terrible tragedy happens. It's 2,000 plus loss of life. All basically you read in the United States is it's Union Carbide's baby. In a corporation, why isn't it whoever the other half of that baby sitting on the hot seat too? And the thing that I'm wondering about is the eventuality. First off, I don't see how it can get into U.S. courts, but the crowd that's trying to get into U.S. courts, I don't know what their angle is, but they'll try. And obviously, for compensatory loss of life, the price is $1. Now, in India's intent with the 6, you went in and you killed something in the order of 2,000 of them in the inner Holy of Holies. I read that the Indian government had made a monetary settlement with them. Now, I'm just wondering what that monetary settlement means in the way of loss of life versus the dollar, divide it, and then see what we can expect the loss of life in India is as a guideline if this thing ever gets into an American court.
I leave that to you. I think you could get that.
Before we began this evening, I asked the ambassador if he would repeat the questions, but at any
I have
time,
a very bad throat.
at any time I do his bidding, of course. As an informational question, in fact, who does own the other half of Union Carbide's investment in India? Secondly, would you comment upon the implications of the settlement with the Sikhs for what they may have upon the litigation concerning Union Carbide here in the United States? Does that capture the thrust of the question?
Well, to give a comparative loss of life value.
Yes. What was the implication of the settlement with the Sikhs, including the question of loss of life value? Yes.
Well, excuse me, may I say first of all that the Sikhs situation has nothing to do with this question. I think whatever happens in civil strife or when a law and order machinery has to operate has got nothing to do with what happens as a result of an industrial disaster. We can draw comparisons with what happens in India where there is industrial disaster, but apart from whether those figures are correct or not, I don't think that there is any parallel at all. I would like to stick to the purely Union Carbide aspect of this and, of course, the Indian government's position in regard to that. Let me make it quite clear, and I think anyone who reads our plaint filed day before yesterday in New York will notice it quite clearly. We have not asked for any figure of compensation. It is not that we are not interested in protecting the interests of those who suffered, but we are not coming here money grubbing. We have our own ways of dealing with people who have suffered, whether through civil strife or from industrial disasters. There are efforts underway to provide suffer and relief and health remedies to those who suffered from the blow-up at Bhopal, as there are in other industrial or, for that matter, train disasters or airline disasters in India. So it's not the figure that we are concerned about. The ownership, to give you the facts, is 50.9% Union Carbide, America, and the rest is between various owners, including the public. It is a limited liability shareholding company, so the shares are held by lots of individuals as well as financial institutions. But the responsibility factor, we have invoked the legal processes of the United States rather than of our own courts, because we are convinced after our initial examination of the case that it arises from a design fault, which is the responsibility of the parent company in the United States. And that is why we have invoked the jurisdiction of the United States courts, which we trust will be accepted on that and other related grounds. And we would be completely abide by whatever the figure the court may consider appropriate. So we are not interested in this in money. We have, if you know, the disaster took place at the beginning of December. We have taken 4 months to try and see if there is any other way we could satisfy the needs of principle as well as the needs of the people. And we have ultimately come to court in the United States because we believe that the company being here has a responsibility to answer to its own law for the fault that developed from its operation in this country. And that is why the question of compensation is almost secondary to our aim.
Ms. Burke?
Indian attorneys, well versed in British law, which of course is the basis of our own, might well take umbrage at the fact that American attorneys have been presumptuous enough to feel that they are needed to argue this. I've wondered about it myself, and I wonder how you feel about the need or the pretentiousness of American attorneys coming in to deal with this matter.
The question is, how do I feel about American attorneys coming in to deal with the Union Carbide case? Well, I take it you're referring to those who have been privately engaged by people in India whom they went and got as clients. I'd rather not comment. This is a matter that is part of your legal system, not ours. But we have also engaged American lawyers to have the case tried, because in an American court you have to have American lawyers.
Yes, sir.
Is there or has there been any change in the foreign policy adopted by the late Prime Minister versus the current Prime Minister?
The question is whether there's been any change in the foreign policy of India following the change of prime ministers in India. The answer is no. I think the foreign policy of India was a reflection of a national consensus that has evolved over our decades of independence, and that it serves certain national interests as viewed by the broad range of Indian opinion. There will obviously be differences of emphasis and priorities at different times in a country's growth and a natural course of history. And there may well, therefore, be some shifts here and there, inevitably, as time moves on. But I don't think we should view this in terms of one prime minister or another.
Yes, sir.
This is not so much a question. Let's just throw a little more light on the Bhopal thing. I was chairman and managing director of Union Carbide India for a number of years prior to Bhopal. In answer to some of the information about the company, this 1984 was its 50th anniversary in India. It was celebrating its golden jubilee. It operates 15 plants throughout India.
18, I think.
Well, I've been out of India. I know it has 18,000 shareholders, all Indian, of the 49.9%. It has 10,000 Indian employees, and for the last 5 years there has not been a foreign employee. The chairman, a very respected friend of mine, Mr. Keshav Mahindra, the managing director, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, both well-trained and excellent in their jobs, and I'm pretty confident that this matter will be settled out of court, and I think to the satisfaction of all concerned. We have too large a stake in India to abandon. We have too many Indian friends whose jobs and livelihood depend on the operation of Union Carbide India. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your even handling of this matter.
Thank you very much. I'd go along with that. Thank you.
Yes, sir, in the back.
There's a very large and prosperous Indian community in South Africa who would suffer immensely from the failure of the white government there. Could you tell us what your government's policy is towards South Africa, and would you presume to advise the US what its policy should be?
You all got the question, or do I need to repeat it? Thank you for making it audible all over. And I don't think any Indian has ever hesitated to give free advice, no matter what the subject or the person. So I would happily not consider it presumption, but well-intentioned duty to say what I would like the United States government to do. But to deal, first of all, with our own approach, you're quite right, the Indian community, which was partly taken to South Africa and partly migrated in the days when it was possible to, has formed one of the most prosperous elements in that society, in relative terms, of course not as prosperous as the white, but they've served a mercantile purpose as well as having been labor to begin with. And we can only share the horror I think all civilized countries do at the type of treatment that apartheid imposes on them no less than on the blacks. The sufferings of the latter attract and deserve, of course, even greater attention and sympathy, but we are conscious of the handicaps of the people of Indian origin, or the Cape-Coloured as they were once called. And we would like to try and assist the international community in bringing about an early settlement. We feel that the hope of getting South Africa to change of its own volition is not being justified by the course of history. and that it will require international pressure, including, if necessary, international sanctions, to get it to act with the sense of responsibility the rest of the international community expects from it, whether in terms of Namibia or in terms of the handling of the non-white population in South Africa. So the thrust of our own efforts have always been to try and get the international community to act as one on this issue. And since certain powers, in the West in particular, and the United States partly, have had a somewhat different view of how to approach the Soviet Union, my only advice to the United States would be to listen to us.
Yes, sir.
Would you comment on the recent developments in PRC and how they will affect Chinese-Indian relations, both in terms of future progress and the border disputes?
Well, I don't think I should comment on the internal affairs of another country, especially one with whom we are trying to develop better relations. I'm sorry, again, I keep forgetting. Did you all get the question? Question was, what did I think of the recent developments in the People's Republic of China, and how would that affect our relations with it? Is that right? Yeah. Well, as I say, I don't want to comment on the internal evolution in China. They are, I think, better analyzed and dealt with in the United States than almost any country I know. You have differing views of those, and I leave it to you to take your own choice on that. But certainly there has been an evolution of China in its relationship to the international community. Its opening to the West and general broadening out is something we have welcomed. And we have felt that we should all encourage it to adopt the type of international role that befits its strength and its civilization, and which we were denied for many years. Denied partly because it was not allowed to function as a member of the international community, but since that stage is past, there's no point in going back now. We always felt that it should have been admitted to the international community much earlier, and in spite of our own very serious problems with it, we stuck to that position. We are therefore glad that it is now functioning in the way it is internationally, and we'd like to strengthen our own relations. In fact, I've been engaged for the 4 years before coming here in precisely that task. It is one of the priorities of the government of India to try and solve our boundary question with China, and then try to develop other relations with it also. The Chinese had originally some hesitations whether the boundary question was ripe for solution, as they would put it. It's a problem, they say, left over from history, and the implication was that perhaps it should be left over to history to solve it. But since this involved territory which we have always regarded as our own and is in their possession, it was perhaps easier for them to take that point of view than it is for us to accept it. And therefore we were pressing for an early resumption of the efforts to find a settlement, and we have embarked on that. We have had 4, or I should now say 5 rounds of talks, and atmosphere has been amicable. And we hope that this is a general trend on the part of China to try and resolve its problems with us and deepen relationship. We have not, frankly, been able to make much progress, but we realize it's a difficult problem, and we are keeping on trying, and we're getting some cooperation with them in other areas.
Yes, Ms. Hayes.
Cholera epidemic in Africa, don't you think it's necessary for the West to intervene more strongly into the situation?
The cholera epidemic in South Africa, whether the West should intervene more strongly. Sorry?
Not South Africa.
No, I understand this. Well, I'm afraid these international crises of this nature, whether it is cholera or some other health problem, or whether it is shortage of water or shortage of food, does place a responsibility on the entire international community to do what it can. And those who are in a better position to help naturally have an added obligation. I'm really not very up to date on what has been attempted on this. I wouldn't like to imply any inadequacy on the part of the West, though I'm sure anything more it can do will be welcome.
Yes, sir.
India is a strong, free, and democratic society, and it has relations with both democratic and non-democratic countries. Can you comment on why India does not recognize the state of Israel?
The question was that India is a strong democracy and has relations with many countries, whether they are democratic or not, and why do we not recognize the state of Israel? The answer, sir, is very simple. We do recognize the state of Israel. We were amongst those in the United Nations who voted in full recognition of the state of Israel. We have a consulate of Israel in India, and we don't have full diplomatic relations, but that's because, there's a difference between having full diplomatic relations and having recognition. We recognize the state of Israel. We have always said that the solution ultimately does lie partly in recognizing the right of Israel to exist, and sooner that is recognized, the better. But we feel that the Palestinian rights have also been violated, and they need to be recognized. And on this, our stand has been that mainly of the Arab countries, and therefore we have felt that the course pursued by Israel is not in keeping with its obligations, and that's why we haven't developed the diplomatic relations. But we have never hesitated to recognize it.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
To divert from foreign policy, Mr. Ambassador, could you tell us what progress has been made toward extending education to the masses in the thousands of villages that have been reputed to be without any education?
The question was what efforts have been made in India to extend education to the villages and other people who have not had education before. The answer, ma'am, is that enormous efforts have been made. But everything you do in India is inadequate because of the sheer size of the problem. You build a hospital, it's already overcrowded. You build a new transport system, it's already overcrowded. You build a new school, it's already overcrowded. So we recognize that we have a very long way to go, but in that effort, I hope the achievements of India will also not fail to be recognized. We have managed, within 7 years of starting, to double our food production, and today can manage to meet our own needs. We have become the 10th largest industrial power in the world. We have the 3rd largest reserve of trained manpower in the world. We have managed to develop an industrial capability which, as I say, not only provides us with this normal type of production, but includes even the most advanced technologies, including space research and nuclear research. But we do realize that everything depends on the health and the education and the nourishment of our people. So those have been the highest priorities of our endeavor. And we have a much higher rate of literacy. I would say, I'm sorry, I'm a little out of date on this. I should have checked those facts, but I think we're more than triple the rate of literacy in India in the first 2 decades, and it's been growing up in the same proportion almost every decade since. But the problems are of sheer numbers, and we recognize that in the rural areas particularly, we have to go beyond the simple ABC that we're in a position to teach in most areas and provide the type of at least secondary, if not higher education, that is a commonplace in Western society. So I would say that enormous progress has been made, but much more remains to be done.
Thank you very much. It's perhaps a bit surprising that we got through an evening without a reference to a jewel in the crown or passage to India. But that's probably absolutely appropriate that our focus remain on India proper, and it's a tribute to the ambassador that he riveted our attention upon India, with what was a masterful presentation, the care of which and the thoughtfulness of which we appreciate very much.